But it's really nice to see everyone. I think some of this is because actually budgets and their role in a modern country have sort of lost their relevance by and large. And so perhaps in the future, Ravi, we should just do two policy sessions a year, maybe one around now and one in the second half of the year, sort of collating all of the policies, both what Manmohan Singh used to call covert policies and overt policies into one. So I think we should take the budget in its larger context of policy action in a given economic environment, both tactical, which is for the short term, and structural for the long term. So I'm going to at least proceed down that path because it's rather depressing to simply speak about this one, which has already been overanalyzed, as most of our budgets are. It's probably the most over-talked about thing on TV, at least in the economic sphere, and it doesn't deserve quite that. But at the same time, we don't talk enough about the collection of things that we do through the year. So hopefully in this session, we'll address some of that. The format we'll go through just today is maybe Dr. Rao will take about 15 minutes, and then I'll take 15 minutes and just put things in context. We'll try not to repeat what you've already heard and read a gazillion times by now in the last 72 hours since the budget, including the budget speech itself. So we won't go through every bit of it, but we'll try to put it in context. Now, one of the things I've also asked Dr. Rao to do, and we can do that perhaps in the second segment, in the midst of the Q&A, he's a real expert in GST. And one of the things we're in the midst of is a somewhat drastic GST failure. So the question is, what's going on in GST? And as member of the 14th Finance Commission, my apologies, 14th Finance Commission, he was instrumental in actually designing some of the indirect tax proposals. So I would venture to say Dr. Rao and Dr. Kelkar together are sort of the two leading experts in indirect tax in India, and we have at least one of them here. So perhaps in the second half of it, we can have a little breakaway segment on GST and why we are at the place we are where tax revenues have to be made up for with non-tax revenues in a budget that already has a reasonable fiscal deficit. So with that, I will ask Dr. Rao to frame his thoughts on the budget. And why don't you expand it to the sort of the policy action over the last 6 or 7 months since?
Well, as I think you've given a good introduction, I think to a considerable extent, budget has lost much of its relevance as it is. In fact, it should have lost much more after 1991. And then, of course, now that you have the entire calibration of indirect taxes is done through the GST Council, that doesn't come into the budget. The indirect tax, internal indirect taxes do not come into the budget. Budget, nevertheless, gives certain signals to the economy. And, and then this particular project, there was a tremendous amount of expectation. Because the first half of the year, the growth rate was just about 4.8%. And for the whole, which was something like, and the last quarter growth was 16 quarters lowest in the last 16 quarters. And for the whole year, it is expected to be something like 5%, the official estimate, which is somewhere about 6-year low, and 10-year low. Now, obviously, there was a lot of hope that budget will sort of kindle animal spirits, revive, and the investment has been falling down from 32% of GDP to 27.8% of GDP. So there was a lot of hope of this thing. But then when, as the budget speech went on, somebody made a remark that the patient is obviously sick, and when she finished it, they said, the doctor is retired hurt. So, no, that's nasty, but that's the joke that went about. But
that's
anyway,
the fundamentalist part of you, is it?
Nothing to do with it. I didn't make that particular thing. I just made it. I just mentioned it. But the point is that one of the other things is the ritual that we have is having an economic survey just before the budget. And there is a complete disconnect between the economic survey and the budget. In fact, there was this interesting quote in the economic survey, and I quote, "The government must use its strong mandate to deliver expeditiously on reforms, which will enable the economy to strongly rebound in 2021. Now, then you have a quote in the budget speech. This thing also says that economic survey also says a sharp decline in real fixed investment induced by sluggish growth of real consumption has weighed down GDP growth from HT 2018-19 to H1 2019-20. Now, and the budget speech says the fundamentals of the economy are strong, and that ensured macroeconomic stability. I don't know which one to follow. In fact, this is where the first problem lies. Now, it is true that there has been a sharp decline, and then one was hoping that there will be a considerable amount of, and particularly a few days earlier, the finance minister had given a press conference saying that they are going to have, in order to achieve the $5 trillion economy, they are going to have 103 trillion, crores, and 103 trillion rupees of investment lined up. Out of that, the private sector was supposed to come in and then have something like 29%. Remaining was to be done by the governments and the public sector, and equally between the states and the center, etc., etc., etc. But what exactly has happened in the budget? There was a lot of talk. In fact, before I go that, let me also tell you, we have a constitution in this country which says that this is a union subject, this is the state subject, this is a concurrent subject. In the budget speech, if you see, first half of the entire budget speech was devoted to the state subject. Now, basically agriculture, irrigation, rural development, health, all these are in the state subject. Now, with all the talk that had, finally she says that we have to seek the cooperation of the state government to implement this. Now, that's a given thing. Why do we really have to, talk so much? What is the allocation from that? Something like 2.8% more than the previous year. There is not really much of an increase in the allocation, but then we talk quite a lot. Now, on the investment side, having talked about $103, 3 trillion rupees investment, the only major thing that, of course, the allocation to railways and this and that is not very, the increase is very nominal. So only thing that they do is they give some 20,000 crores for infrastructure. They invest 20,000 crores in equity for putting in infrastructure companies, infrastructure financing companies. Now, saying that this will generate a loan of somewhere about 100,000, sort of 1 lakh crores. That's basically the thing. Now, how can any animal spirit be woken up, with this type of this thing? One doesn't know. Now, this is, so on the investment side, if you look at it again, the capital expenditure of the government was 1.7% in the current year, and in the budget, it comes something like 1.8% of GDP. Now, I would say that the GDP numbers have been projected more realistically than in the past. And in fact, in the earlier budget, this year they were supposed to talk about 12%, and actual growth was estimated for 7.5%. This is in nominal terms. And next year, she makes a projection of 10%. And that is also the same projection which the Finance Commission, 15th Finance Commission makes in its recommendations. Now with that, one would hope that, sort of things will be realistic, but not really so. You see, the FRBM review committee had recommended that under exceptional circumstances, if there are, whether it is war with another country or serious distress or sort of structural reforms involving fiscal changes, fiscal, impact, having the impact, you can, change the fiscal deficit target by 0.5 percentage point. This is N.K. Singh's FRBM review committee. Now, so she invokes that, and incidentally, the Finance Commission recommendation also says that, 15th Finance Commission recommendation. So she invokes that, that's fine. So she said, instead of 3.3, 3.8, next year it is 3.5. The review committee says that, you see, after doing that, immediately you should return to the path. So actually, if you look at the medium-term fiscal framework part, it comes back only after, it doesn't come back in the 3 years, it comes much later. But in any case, I'm going to grant that. It's okay, because I'm not, even though I'm called a fiscal fundamentalist, I'm willing to say that at the present juncture, we may have to relax. But look at the off-budget liabilities. The off-budget liability come to somewhere about, basically the main off-budget liability is the Food Corporation of India borrowing from the National Small Saving Fund. That in itself, comes somewhere about some 0.8, 0.9% of GDP. So your real fiscal deficit in that sense of the term, 4.8. And this does not include the pending bills which the government has not paid off. I mean, let us understand that. See, when the government has the cash accounting system and not accrual accounting, so you can do a lot of manipulation there. So you do have, but more than anything else, even this revised estimate of 3.8% is very difficult to meet, because so far the disinvestment revenue is 18,000 crores. The revised estimate said that we are going to get 65,000 crores. Are we going to collect 47,000 crores in the next 2 months if we have not done it in the 10 months? I don't know. They may have some this thing, but, and again, even if you look at the revenues, tax revenues that have been found, even after the moderation, you have a growth rate of 14% over the actuals of the previous year. I'm not very sure whether that can be realized. If it cannot be realized, there will be problem. One other issue that I just want to say in this is, because of that you have your unrealistic sort of projections of revenue, the biggest sufferers are the states. Because you have completely, the variation is more than 1.5 lakh crores. Now what has happened is that obviously the tax devolution to the states, sort of has to be done 42%. And the state's budget thinking that this is the projection, and this is and then during the course of the year, they are required to cut down. You see, that's one of the major problems that we have. Anyway, now on the tax part, I'm not going to go on with the deficit numbers, but on the tax part, one of the biggest, of course, the best practice approach to tax reform is to broaden the base, reduce the rate differences, and have a simple and transparent tax system. We have tried to broaden the base and given the option in the individual income tax, but did we really require 6 brackets? 5 to 7.5, 7.5 to 10, 10 to 15, 15 to 20. Did we really require that? Are we not going back to the pre-1991 era? It was Chelaya committee where we all had worked together to simplify the thing and bring it down to 3 rates. And then Chidambaram, who actually brought down the rates to 30, 20 and 10. Now the question is, many other people who have been taking this, taking the tax concessions would find, in fact, it doesn't know how many people really will switch over to the new system, but it only has helped to complicate the matter. Even then, I said there is some hope that over a period of time they will phase out the tax concessions, because tax policy is not a kamadhenu. You can't have so many objectives thrust on the tax policy. The job of the tax policy is to raise revenue and just confine it to raising revenue. Maybe in some equitable manner in the personal income tax case. And even equity, basically the consensus these days around the world by the tax economists is that this is done better to the expenditure side of the budget than trying to complicate the tax system. The most retrograde step in the budget, in fact, Arvind Panagadia, who was in the Niti Aayog, even he had to say this, is continuing with protectionism. increasing the customs tariff across the board, and then all in the name of Make in India. I don't know, Make in India for what? To create a non-competitive system? Are we not interested in joining the global value chain at all? We don't want to be we don't want to be competitive. And how much of protection can you go on giving this? And then there is a joke. She talks about the medical devices given protection, and that became competitive, and then they were able to export, and therefore she wants more protection to be given. I can't understand this logic. Anyway, this thing. One final thing, as I said, is I want to basically say, as I said, as far as the expenditure allocation is concerned, there is nothing to revive the investment nor the consumption. In fact, if you see the actual allocations, they are, in many cases, it's higher than the revised estimates of marginally higher than the revised estimates of current year for the next year. But then if you look at the budget estimate of the current, current year, this is actually lower in many cases. In any case, as I said, this is a difficult time. But if somebody thinks that the budget is going to revive the economy, I think that expectation, this is one of those, budgets which generally is done. But the states are likely to suffer much more because the tax devolution, the shortfall in tax devolution to the states is 1.53 lakh crore. Now, that is where I stop.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Rao. So, in the earlier session a few days ago, the axes that we were looking at, one was fiscal conservatism versus fiscal profligacy or fiscal stimulus, depending on your persuasion. The second was whether government should do government consumption or government investment. And then the third one was whether government should have some sort of enlightened 21st century industrial policy. And then the fourth one was whether we were unintentionally tightening too many things at the wrong time. So I'll come back to these sort of four axes on the budget through the conversation. But let me summarize and let me use the context of 2 decades or more in sort of putting this in context for those of you who have not thought of it this way. I think too often we think of it very sort of locally and very tactically in terms of time, and we don't put it in context. So I think if there was any doubt at all that the liberalization era is over, you should not be in any doubt anymore. So we have gone back to what you might call an administrative, somewhat statist, somewhat protectionist, import substitution version era that existed before the liberalization era. So you can sort of bookend the 25 years of India's liberalization era is over. I don't know exactly when it started, but let's just say 25 years from 92 to 2017. And from 2016-17 onwards, we have gone into this new era. Now, this is not purely a Modi government phenomenon. It is probably partly in response to what's happening around the world with all the populist governments, partly in response to some market failures, and particularly related to the global financial crisis and so on. So we can go into the deeper reasons for why this might be the case, but putting it in a very large context, I think that sort of era of global trade, China accessing the WTO, dramatic gains from trade, and in India's context from software services, that era is behind us. We are in a much more cloudy, different era. Exactly how to characterize that in a global context is going to evolve even as we speak. So that's the first observation. The second observation, even as we enter that era, we don't appear to have a cogent economic framework. By the way, even communist economics has a cogent economic framework. You may like it or you may not dislike it, but at least it's cogent. Right now, on many, many dimensions, we have complete lack of coherence and cogency. So we like private sector, we hate private sector. We want taxes, we hate taxes. We want to give tax charter, we want to do tax terrorism. So on multiple dimensions, we have this permanent state of schizophrenia. And this is not good for the economy because consistency of a certain sort is required in order to pursue whatever objective it is that you pursue. You may agree or disagree, but systematism and cogency is a requirement. Let me just illustrate some of these. So, for instance, as Dr. Rao just mentioned, I think the FM didn't talk about it too much because she took ill towards the end, but import substitution and the duties on several goods have gone up. It didn't come through the speech, but in the budget documents, you will actually see that in the finance bill, you'll see the entire set of things, and they've been steadily going up. They've gone up even further. In that, we have thrown in this anti-dumping, this rationalization for why this has to be the case and so on. There is, of course, some dumping, and rather than target that specifically and clearly and crisply, we have once again resorted to sort of a blunt instrument of higher duties on a whole host of goods, including furniture, to tackle this so-called dumping problem. So this will unfortunately make us even less competitive in the world, and it will ensure not make in India, but that we will have to make for India, because we will not be able to get much from the outside on several things. So that's one complete inconsistency. Now, at the same time, we have, if anybody benefited from this budget, it was actually the foreign investor. So this is exactly at the same time when we have said make in India and everything is great and so on. We have actually benefited the foreign investor through some concessions on FPI and corporate bonds and sovereign bonds, some concessions on taxation for sovereign investors, etc. So they are actually the biggest. It's a small thing, but it's the biggest beneficiary in this. But unequivocal beneficiary in this is the foreign FPI investor. And even the DDT actually plays through the subsidiary taxation for MNCs. So if you take 2 or 3 provisions together, actually the foreign investor is the beneficiary. So you have one major dichotomy right there. Now, we do need foreign investor right now, but one cogent long-term response for Make in India. One of the things we absolutely need to make in India is our own long-term pools of capital. And no budget addresses this in a meaningful way, and this budget has fallen short as well. So rather than say that while we are wooing foreign investors, we will also create a parallel system of long-term pools of investing in the country, we have not done that. The two somewhat required, but in the context of an otherwise timid budget, relatively bold steps. One is they finally bit the bullet and have said they will privatize IDBI. For those of you who don't know, of all the PSU banks, IDBI is the only one that is listed under a private charter, and in that sense was entirely privatizable without much legislative change. And in a sense, legally, it had the least protection on, government sector workers' compensations and stuff like that. So this IDBI thing should have been done 3-4 years ago, but they are so paranoid about being accused of crony capitalism, of somebody who would come and take over IDBI and therefore be gifted an asset and so on, though IDBI is only debatably discussed as an asset. But this should have been done at least 3-4 years ago. But hopefully they will complete it now. They've announced it. Let's see if they can complete it. The other one is the LIC. I see the positive in the LIC announcement. By the way, this is not privatization. I would call this demonopolization. It is simply taking whatever, 8-10% of LIC and listing it on the exchanges. But it has two positives. One positive is it does raise revenues resources. As Dr. Rao in the earlier conversation said, one of the ways to avoid the the fiscal deficit is to actually generate resources through asset sales. But the good thing about the LIC sale is rather than continuously insist that you will sell terrible assets, finally you have insisted that you might actually sell a halfway decent asset. So this is actually not a bad idea. And it will also do another thing, that is LIC, at least the tail of the LIC portfolio, is completely in a quagmire, and at least it will become available to us to see what is in LIC. So that as they say, sunlight is the best disinfectant, and we will at least know a little about what is in LIC as this comes to list. So positive overall, and taken together with BPCL, I think it should be realizable in the next, hopefully 12 months, but at least 12 to 24 months. So that would be another positive. See, the interesting thing is, over the last 25 years, and now this may be in the liberalization era, it is very clear that lesser tax, simpler tax, more understandable tax has led to better tax compliance. There is actually no doubt in India's experience, leave alone somebody else's experience, in India's experience that this is true. That's number one. Number two, this word that economists like to use called tax buoyancy. It's very clear that tax buoyancy non-linearly rises with GDP. So, we have this multiplier that says GDP is X, tax is 1.2X or 1.5X. I think the assumption in this next year is 1.2. But it is actually a function of GDP itself. And therefore, when GDP is high, such as it was in, say, 2003 to 2008, tax buoyancy was 1.5 times that. And when GDP was low, such as it was in 2009, 2010, it had actually fallen below GDP even. So it's actually a very perverse function of GDP. So again, even from a tax buoyancy point of view, the focus should have been on growth and creation of jobs and all of that. And there seems to be a little bit of a lack of imagination on how the history of how this translates into thing. Now, I mentioned to you that foreign investors have been somewhat benefited by this. Now, they needlessly threw something in on NRIs. Total, and I mean, it is utter stupidity. It does nothing for anybody. The number of people who are dodging, living in a single country, I mean, God forbid for those few people, must be a nightmare just going from country to country just to dodge taxes. But for those catching those some, I don't know, hundreds of people, we have created an entire system which essentially half of Dubai called overnight to find out what the heck is going on. Do I have to pay taxes now? Right? Why do we invite this upon ourselves that we don't think through this? I mean, it would have been the most obvious thing. I think the Babus just don't understand this, so they're all working in their theoretical towers. And so this NRI thing was just hogwash. I think it's going to be removed. There's no consistency to it at all. And I think it's got to go. So in summary, I would say to you, there's no clear path ahead. This budget looks like it was a committee budget. Some people say it was done in South Block, but it doesn't have the clarity of South Block. Whether you like the clarity or not, it doesn't have the clarity of South Block. So it's probably some sort of committee. People did pieces of it, and then they put it together. And the hapless finance minister had maybe all of 6 hours to actually figure out what exactly it was in it. And so we have what we have right now. The tragedy of this is we will actually get a cyclical rebound in the next little while. That cyclical rebound is most likely, believe it or not, going to be led by agriculture. We, for a change, have had a phenomenal rain season, and waters everywhere are full. And so we will actually have a halfway decent agriculture season. Agriculture growth rates in the last few years were between 2 and 2.5% or so. Potentially, they could be as high as 3.5% or more for the next year. So we'll get a little bit of a rebound from there. But that I worry that just kicks the can down the road. And all you have done is reascended the precipice so you can fall more at the end of it. Because we will still lack investments and we will lack sustainable consumption at the end of it. Though some of that agriculture will obviously go into rural consumption. So we might get 18 months or so of reasonable sort of rural consumption / agricultural growth coming from very good rains pretty much throughout the country, except in very small pockets. So let me stop there. I don't know whether you want to add anything to...
No, I just want to add to this particular thing.
Yeah.
last year, agricultural growth, I'm sorry, for the current year, agricultural growth is estimated at about 2.8%.
2.8, yeah.
Now, obviously, that is likely to it might even touch 4%.
4%.
It's quite possible. But my concern is the other one, namely that this year, the 2019-20, if you take out the public administration and defense, government consumption expenditure, that growth rate is actually, excluding that, is 3%. All the other sectors, including, now, there is not much of a room for public administration and defense in the next year. Agriculture will possibly grow, but then there may be some dampening there, and how it plays out, one has to see.
Okay, why don't we pause there and we can take both questions on this budget and its immediate implications, but also on the longer sort of evolution of the country's economic policy. I think there's a gentleman here. And we'll try, if you don't mind, why don't you self-select your questions to bunch together? Otherwise, we'll swap between expenditure and revenues and between taxes and other things. So if you don't mind, ask a string of questions in one direction and we can go in another. We have plenty of time. So at least 45 minutes, possibly even an hour. So we have plenty of time, and what we had intended to do was to keep it very interactive. So if you can self-select a cluster of questions, that'd be great, please.
Two quick questions. So one is, when you mention about the budget making committee, etc., what's really the role of the Economic Advisory Council and the Chief Economic Advisor? Because they are very learned economists, and I know Dr. Govind has been there, in the ringside, with the ringside view. So what's the role of these learned, economists in making this budget? That's question one. And question two is, what's really going to happen to common men in India now? I mean, if you say liberalization era is over, how the life is going to pan out in the next 1 year or 2 years?
Excellent question. So why don't we'll take that, if you don't mind, before we go to other questions. Why don't you...
Well,
I'm going to generalize the question. I think it's an excellent one. To what has been the method of influence, and is the method of influence in the process of change? So...
Economic Advisory Council, actually the chairman of the Economic Advisory Council is called for some of the meetings. The council itself doesn't really have much of a role. The chairman of the council possibly, meets the finance minister and then basically talks to her, what the various things are, what are the various directions in which they can go. There is a longer sort of consultation process which is, with various groups, industries and this and that. That's a different thing. Other than that, Economic Advisory Council doesn't really play much of a role in the scheme of things, specific scheme of things. Chief Economic Advisor's role is basically to write the economic survey. I'm not even certain that he's being called to many of the meetings, very detailed meetings. But even in the meetings when, many other secretaries and many other, people meet, now ultimately, the entire thing is done by the, sort of three, four secretaries in the Ministry of Finance. And they are the ones who basically do the thing. And...
mostly the Joint Secretary.
Huh?
Joint Secretary does most of the writing.
Yeah, the writing is done by them, but then basically he writes what these people ask him to write.
Yeah.
Basically, it's not that, just something like 20 days before the budget presentation, there is something like a halwa sort of a program there, and people are quarantined. In fact, they are just put inside and then they are this thing. The budget speech is separately written, and but then, what happens is that in the past, the finance ministers were quite, they also had quite a good idea about things. And then they used to take a lot of, sort of from the, in fact, Dr. Rangarajan, when he was the chairman of the Economic Advisor, in fact, we would meet, I was a member of the council, we would meet and then say that these are the major things that we could tell the finance minister. And there was a meeting in the Prime Minister's office where both the finance minister and, other major ministers used to come in. And then, Rangarajan was asked to give things. So ideas were given. I don't know what exactly is happening now.
So I'll answer this question in a slightly different way. India has followed two methods of influence for all policy, not just the budget. So one method is the Indian hustle method, right, which is get close to the budget and each stakeholder tom-toms their book, as they call it, and say, I want this duty reduction, I want this, etc. Few people have an inordinate voice, so we have had cases in India's history where budget policies have been written for single firms. So that's the negative and very sort of political economy influence method. The positive influence method historically has been that questions get raised in society, in parliament, in the ambience, and they get answered through a series of committees. And in those committees, you have experts, including, for instance, how the GST itself took place. You have experts who come to the committee, and in a manner of speaking, India is not short of the best ideas in the world. In fact, to some extent, perhaps every idea in the world is practiced to some small extent only in India. I mean, if you take school vouchers, which America is having such a difficult time even putting partly into practice. We have had school vouchers, we have had conditional cash transfers, we have had quasi-universal universal transfers. You name it, virtually anything that you can conceive of, we have tried in some way. And that's partly because there has been a lateral and expert ability to influence through these committees. Now, in this process, we also now have two other things, which is we now have independent think tanks and government-funded think tanks, which we did not have before in any meaningful measure. So we now have those also pitching in to add to the discourse. So some, for instance, legal provisions such as the street vendor law, or even the RTI, actually RTI came from the civil society. So those kind of things make an impact on the influencing process. This appears to have broken down a little bit in the last 3 or 4 years, in the sense that no new ideas are being put out for discussion, and old ideas are being tossed around among the same 25 people. So we have become an insular university up top in Rajpath. And that is, I think, will begin to hurt us some, because the ability to bring in lateral thinking, to bring in the best in the world. Now, bizarrely, the chief economic advisor tosses in 20 different ideas. For instance, even the latest one, which is an absolute mishmash between Adam Smith and all kinds of things that you can read in there. But one or two of those ideas get picked up, like Arvind Subramanian's universal basic income, or private sector brings back the animal spirits, and so on, right? Because the prevailing view here is to curb the animal spirit, because all animals are considered animals. That's true too. That's true too. So we are in. I think the reason why civil society is raising its voice is to say not that they are right all the time, but to widen the scope of input. So I think this is something that we'll have to watch as to what is the method of influence. So in fact, bizarrely, what I say is we should oscillate between a UPA and an NDA government. UPA will, mess up the fiscal side, etc., but will throw in 4 new ideas. And then maybe NDA will sort of keep more or less the fiscal side in balance, but will begin to implement those ideas because they can't think for themselves. So we should oscillate between the two. This may be the best forward-looking plan for India. Now, the second part of your question, which is what happens. I mean, I don't know how Dr. Rao would answer this, but I will answer this in the following way, which is, luckily for India, we are still in what I call the quantity phase of development. So you put one piece of input in, you at least get one out, maybe a little bit more than one out, if you add little total factor productivity into it. So we've got this phase going for a little longer. And while that phase lasts, we are okay. But we are okay only if we also invest for the next phase. And that second thing is not happening at all. So right now, we will get between, pick a number, 4 and 8% growth just because we've got the demographics for it. And we have so much inefficiency in the system that if we avoid a little stupidity, we have little productivity on the other side, right? So that takes us, and I would say that takes us 6, 7, 8 years from now. But then we hit a wall unless we have R&D spending, unless we have better primary education, unless we have better basic health, and so on. You need both the workforce and the masala to get out of that $4,000, $4,500 of income, per capita income. I mean, people have different views on whether there is or there is not a middle income trap, but India is racing into it. That would be my view. I don't know whether.
Well, I mean, we still have investment GDP ratio of somewhere about 27-28%. So, in the normal course of inefficiency that we have, we should be able to generate a growth rate of anywhere between 4 to 6%.
Yeah, 2% comes simply from labor force growth. Partly employed, partly unemployed. But
that's basically the thing. But we could do much better. That's concern. The people like me get agitated very quickly for the reason that we can. There is so much that we can do. We can do so much better, and we are just wasting our time. And look at, say, the children in the age group of 0 to 14, almost 30 to 32% of the population. And what are we doing to them? I mean, see, we are wasting our time, we are wasting our resources. What are we going to do to them? And, this demographic system, in fact, in places like Bihar and UP, they're almost 40%. And we just don't care. Now, that's the concern, and therefore, in fact, when I wrote this article in Hindu yesterday, Dr. Reddy sent saying that, sort of very straightforward sort of a thing. But the point is, I can't hide my, disappointment. That's all that I want to say.
Hi, my name is Nitin Wagh. A couple of points and then comments. First of all, I don't understand something they have introduced called tax deduction at source when you transfer more than 7 lakh rupees of foreign exchange. Now, I don't know how that works and how they are going to monitor it. But the broader question that I have is, we always talk about creating jobs and, that way have the money in the hands of the people and things like that. But I think there is a limit to how much jobs you can create. And I think the economy works on probably only 300, 400 million people. And balance, all the other people are being supported. So I don't know how many jobs can actually be created unless and until the concept of everybody becoming a small entrepreneur kind of thing. So what are your thoughts on how, because the era that you're talking about, the 90s, luckily we got the IT industry. And then they were taking people lock, stock, and barrel. Today they are taking some barrel, but then they are putting on the bench. Most of the people today who are recruited are probably on the bench. So that happened luckily. What are the chances of something like that happening? Because now nobody wants anybody from outside. Everybody is controlling their own borders. So in that situation, how do you create jobs? And because in bigger buildings we have 3 liftmen in one lift. Now, is that the job that we want to create or what? I don't know. Thanks.
On the first part of the question, again, you see, this is a complete lack of trust in the people, basically that. So they think that, you have a liberalized, scheme in which you can, transfer something like $250,000 every year.
per person.
Huh?
Per person.
Per person. Now, the fear is that many of these people will generate, sort of income somewhere, and then in order to do that, they will send it. So you take some, sort of some tax deduction at source, so that they are made to, they are made to sort of show how they got that $250,000. That's the thing. And I mean, basically trying to put an additional, we believe in the following. We believe in a system where a car should have 10 different brakes. It's one brake will, so one brake doesn't succeed. So in fact, most of the time, all the 10 don't succeed. But then the point is, basically, it's an additional brake that they're trying to bring. That's what I feel. Now, on the question of jobs, you see, the problem is, over a period of time, you have had regulation in the system, particularly inflexible labor laws, where a small and medium industry refuses to become, medium, refuses to become large. Because if you have more than 100 workers, the number of inspectors that will come to you and the way in which the whole thing works is enormous. And then obviously you can't take anybody out. I mean, you just can't remove anybody if you have more than 100 workers. So the problem starts the moment you have 40 workers and more. So even many of the things where, as I said, textile fabrics, for example, where even Bangladesh and Vietnam have been able to have massive factories. We are not able to do it, and then there is some experiment going on in Chhattisgarh where they are giving wage subsidy in order to train women. In fact, quite a number of women are getting employed there. And then, in fact, the state government says that we will not look at the labor laws at all. I mean, that's something. And some of the major multinationals have come, and then they are sourcing there. I mean, there are ways in which, so the entire labor-intensive industrialization, in fact, has stopped. More, sort of service sector, the controls were less after liberalization. Manufacturing sector controls were more. So the service sector really went fast. And so we have actually, generally from agriculture, you go to industry and then services. We have bypassed industry, and the industrial output is actually over a period of time shrinking. So I think there are some structural reforms, both in land and labor market, that they are required to do if you really want labor-intensive industrialization to take place. And there is no talk about that. In fact, the economic surveys for the last 6 years have been talking about it, except this one. But, and then, there was a lot of hope that, when BJP comes, in fact, one of the things they were talking about is liberalizing the labor laws. And in fact, some of the state government started doing it, but then, no, you see, it's a holy cow. Nobody wants to touch it. So that's where the problem is. And we can industrialize it, we can employ. And then, when you take it, and then you take it in, and say, Pakoda Wala is also an employment. I mean, that's the type of thing that, obviously, we need to have meaningful employment.
So, just a few comments. First, what India does is not uniformly bad. So, for instance, the provision that each Indian citizen can remit $250,000 a year is actually the best in the emerging market world. There's no close second. Anybody with a dirty float, the free currency is a free currency, but anybody who doesn't have a free currency, India actually has the best. So there's something positive there, right? Now, the big thing with this TDS thing that they're trying to catch, this is my guess, is this designed for the lowest common fraud, is the round tripping. So entire FEMA, if you look at it, law that Putin would be proud of, the whole structure of FEMA is this round tripping, and round tripping particularly as it relates to bringing money back for campaign. So this is the logic of FEMA. So that's what they're trying to catch. So in a way, we have the best and the worst coexisting in one. The logic of applying a penny tax is actually not a bad idea. If you think about it, the straight-through tax in India that we can pay is among the best in the world. I mean, you and I can write a check through the electronic system for taxes. You can't do this. US included, this is a tough proposition. So in the US, you have to write an old-fashioned check. You cannot send it through the wire, so to speak. So we have done some good things, and the process of this penny TDS, or 1% TDS, by the way, it was very successful in land sale. For those of you who don't know, there's a 1% sale on land transfers, property transfers. And in so doing, you catch both sides of the land transaction, because historically land was one of the biggest sources of the alternative economy. So there have been, I think it's actually a halfway decent idea. Now, I don't know it's specifically related to Forex. It seems irrelevantly small to actually worry about it. But such as it is, there is a purpose. The larger question on industrial policy, I am not as pessimistic as you that we cannot facilitate or enable employment. Take tourism as one simple example. It's in the services sector. It's not in the manufacturing sector. But take tourism. I think if this room decided that over the next 5 days we are going to come up with 10 ideas for tourism, I think in this room we can generate 100,000 jobs. Just in tourism. We have the Buddhist circuit in Bihar. We have, I don't know, how many of you know there is a place called Pattadakkal in Karnataka? Pattadakkal, can you please raise your hands? Okay, let's say it's 50% of the audience. This is in Karnataka. And I am going to put it on record here that Pattadakkal is at least as interesting as Angkor Wat. And we don't know. Angkor Wat is world famous. Yeah, Badami and Pattadakkal have, great history, phenomenal architecture, halfway decent hotels. They're not really that great. They could be improved. But, even in the Karnataka audience, we don't know about Pattadakkal. So there's plenty of opportunity in easy to handle sectors. Now, there are issues. There are issues of infrastructure, not good enough hotels in Badami. There are issues of hygiene. There are issues of female safety, for instance. So some of these have to be addressed if tourism is going to become a little bit better. But it doesn't have to become, magically that much better. Hopefully, someday India will have more visitors than the Louvre, properly counted. We count the NRIs as visitors, so therefore we don't, we still say we have a little bit more than the Louvre after 2016. But can you imagine that? India has 50,000 outdoor museums, and we can't compete with one, indoor one. So it's just a tragedy. So I think if we put our mind to it, there's tremendous opportunity. For instance, in the marine, they did mention it, Sagar Mitra or something. I don't know, they just complicated with all these terminologies that, anyway, the Sagar Mitra, long story short, marine economy has tremendous potential. India has one of the best coastlines, if not the longest coastlines for marine economy. And there's so much that can be done from the marine economy that can benefit at least those coastal areas. So I think if you think about it part after part after part, there's a lot we can do. Now, what is government's role in that? That, I think, has to be thought through. A government shouldn't have a uniformly paternalistic role in everything. On the other hand, government can catalyze 3-4 different things coming together. So it can catalyze private sector, it can catalyze associations, and it can catalyze marketing and branding entities so that the cluster can deliver. So I think you can have different roles in different sectors depending on what it is. And certainly it is a complete lack of imagination that we have not been able to. I was in Gujarat last week. How many of you know that Gujarat has at least as good wildlife as Rajasthan? Show of hands. Okay. Gujarat, in my view, actually has better wildlife than Rajasthan, at least if you count out the human wildlife in it, so it's less crowded. But the roads are terrible. So the myth we live in is Gujarat has good roads. Except for the Ahmedabad-Bhuj road, every road goes up and down. I don't know how many of you are from Gujarat. Terrible. They're worse than Karnataka roads, and that's, that's really bad. Nowhere near Tamil Nadu roads. So, why not put some money into Gujarat roads and promote Gujarat tourism with Amitabh Bachchan is shouting off the rooftop?
We have the environmentalists, and when you have the Konkan belt being developed, and we are not able to develop it at all because of the environmental problems.
No, but it's
I think that the government should enforce this
Yes and no. I think it's lack of clarity. You have to know what you're listening to and what you're not listening to. And you have to, you can't just bulldoze your way. You have to give alternative solutions, right? So I think, at least in my view, and I leave it open to the others to decide as well, but in my view, there is plenty of opportunity for us to enable many 21st century versions of helping industry create jobs. And skilling is certainly one of them. We can talk about in a second, but please go ahead, sir.
Sir, my name is Ramachandran. My question is on agricultural sector. I think this particular budget made some attempts, at least it has shown some kind of a instinct towards bringing in some kind of value for the growers, basically. I find it very interesting when FCI creates warehouses across the country, and those warehouses will become virtual markets. I think that kind of an investment in these warehouse-based selling would bring in lot of liquidity to the markets, basically. Now, we don't have a national integrated spot markets. All markets are isolated. We have more than 7,500 regulated markets in the country, and all of them will have a very inefficient price discovery mechanism. I mean, the basis of one location with other location will have substantial price variations. So this particular, you said that why it is a state subject, why center should intervene in this matter is, I would like to have the center to host this kind of an activity. Otherwise, each state will behave in a different way. Some states, for example, Odisha, there is no market at all. Absolutely, there is no market at all. And center tried with ENAM, National Agricultural Market. It failed. They thought that computerization is market making. Basically it is a market. They are creating a market. No, there is no liquidity at all. So this particular thought of central government in this particular, areas of bringing logistics, adding warehousing, and bringing that kind of a extended markets, like creating virtual markets, I think it's a good idea. It should have been done long back, actually. I think that part, I think center should take the responsibility, and they have got the right approach to do this. So they have the role to play. They have to bring in states, because all states will behave differently, actually. Completely, they misbehave, actually.
Yeah. So at least I'm certainly not a big expert on agriculture, so I'll refrain from commenting too much. Few thoughts. One, the entire value chain, I think, needs thinking. So you've mentioned the very end, which is right before it gets to the customer. But right at the very beginning, I think we need to switch cropping patterns entirely based on water use. So we need a water budgeted crop pattern rather than a land or FCI sourcing budgeted land use, which is what we have. Because FCI procures wheat and rice disproportionately, everybody grows wheat and rice. And there was actually an excellent presentation in, I don't know, did we tape that? Yeah, by Mihir Shah in a few days ago, 4 days ago. Did we tape that?
Yeah, but this is the science gallery. We have to get it.
Yeah, let's get that if we can. It's actually.
PowerPoint things with me.
Yeah.
But he also showed a couple of videos that well worth watching.
Yeah, so Mihir Shah actually did it about 5 days ago, right before our budget session, which is the only session delayed at the BIC thanks to that presentation. But it was actually an excellent one. And it effectively mentioned this idea about water budgeted cropping. That's number one. Number two, we have been talking about irrigation forever. And it's a tragedy of India that in 1947, we were 49% irrigable, and today we are roughly the same, maybe 1% or 2% increase with all these dams and irrigation canals and check dams and this, that, and the other thing. We've increased by 1 or 2% in 70 years. So it's a complete failure of the entire system that we haven't been able to increase it even 4 or 5%. By the way, in the area of agriculture, if you add land, climate, India is actually not under-endowed. China is in a disaster zone. China, despite having 3 times the land, has roughly 1/2 of irrigable season adjusted crops than India, for instance. So the opportunity is just plentiful. We underuse it. The mandi side of the things that you're talking about, we had a spot market that went down in flames, as you know. It was that is the fraudulence of the of the corporate walas. So we have that as well. So that went down, and with that went everything. So we haven't been able to revive that national spot market to any extent. But given all the technology, at least regionally or at least crop-wise, we can decide between national and regional. But there's definitely a great opportunity through the chain, but even at the end with the use of computers.
Just supplement. I think the agricultural sector requires a lot of reforms, both in terms of putting more investments in warehousing, marketing, creating markets, and processing, and various a number of extension services that you need to do, and of course in pricing. The point is that you give the wrong signals through pricing mechanism. Government takes over the function of the market and then sort of fixes the prices, and the entire cropping pattern changes. That's a major. And you don't charge water, you don't charge electricity, and then obviously water-intensive crops become a major thing. There is a whole lot of things that need to be done. But the point is, and then of course there is, there was a reference to changing the APMC Act. And the very...
Been since 2014. Or maybe even earlier.
That's right. No, even in this budget, she talks about taking... And interestingly, the Finance Commission report, 15th Finance Commission report says that we are going to create some incentive structure for some grants if you change the APMC Act and, based on the Model Act, etc. Now, all these are fine, but all these have to happen at the state level. How do you really incentivize the states to do it? There are special interest groups that have gone into the system. And, if you say that you don't want to charge, you want to charge for water, you charge for electricity, obviously the party in power doesn't want to do it. And then obviously, in places like Punjab, procurement of food grains is the major occupation. And then, so there is a major thing that has to be done. And then major switchover from the subsidy regime, food and fertilizer regime, to the investment regime, where you need to really make a lot more of investment in, in irrigation, in marketing, in warehousing, cold storage, transportation. She did a lot of good talk she did, but she can't do anything. My problem is, it's all in the state subject. She can only say that you do this, or I will give you some money if you do this. But then, at the end of the day, it's the states that have to do it.
And maybe there's somebody who's an expert on this in the room, but we have not, at independence, there was a strong logic for the land policies that led by, for instance, Kerala and West Bengal, we put in place. So it was defeudalizing essentially any place where the zamindari system existed versus the Ryotwari system. So like anything that should have had a death date, but we are living with the zombie of that policy today. And our society is not able to figure out how to get to the next stage. So how do you go from fragmenting land, which was the right idea in the societal idea in the context of a feudal system, to defragmenting a land when you need efficiency that would result from all the modern technology and so on. So corporatization, land consolidation, can one person own it? Can you lease the land and consolidate it? So I think it's ripe for land reform of a totally opposite nature. But so far, none of these original states are in a position to even conceive of this.
No, but one of the good news is that you see the proportion of horticultural, production in the total has been increasing.
It's been increasing.
And that is basically a market response. I mean, basically, that's, and then at least there is talk about contract, sort of leasing out land and contracting and things like that. I mean, that's one of the things that she spoke about. Now, that's one of the things, there is a model act for, sort of land leasing. And so even the
But it has
finance
to be led by state political policy
But
before
that
it becomes state economic policy, like it was the other way around, right? We need a reverse reform in many states. So far, we are just sort of trudging along. And in the when we're trudging along, we are going to get to between 1 and 3% growth in agriculture. Instead, we can easily make it 4 and 5. So the technocracy of it exists right today. But the political economy of it doesn't exist today. So somehow they have to match. And when that matches, we will get agriculture firing for us in a big way, because yields are very low, degree of mechanization and modern seeds is very low, consolidation of land in whatever manner is very low. So, I mean, for us, productivity from land can easily be 3, 4, 5 times what it is today in a pure technology sense or structure sense of the term. But the political economy must want it and allow it. And that's sort of what we've been waiting for a long time.
Hello, sir. Here.
Yeah, please.
This is Subramaniam. And you mentioned about FRBM's review committee by NK Singh. So my question is, what is the need for specifically having 3% as the limit for FRBM?
What is the magic of 3?
What is the logic behind that number? What is the because anyway, if the government is going to spend huge, they can check what is the prevailing conditions around, and then they can manage by themselves. What is the need for a law to say that 3% is the mandated, the number?
I'll explain to you what the need. In fact, I did explain it in the musings that we had.
Okay.
See, I mean, around 2001, 2002, there was a massive inflation, and then economy was slowing down, and the deficit was way out of tune with what it should be. At that time, they appointed a committee under the then Economic Affairs Secretary, E.A.S. Sharma, who basically worked out the entire, sort of reform framework. And he said, in fact, if you look at the original constitution in itself, it says that the parliament can impose, limits on the debt that the government should undertake. But then they had not done that. So he said that, look, increasing, going on borrowing, and increasing the debt of the government is not the way forward. And that also takes away the money that is available for others to, borrow. And therefore, so he actually started the process. The 12th Finance Commission, which was chaired by Rangarajan, actually went into the detail and said, you have corporates, corporates, government, and households. These are the 3 major sectors in the economy. If you look at the savings and investment, corporates are net borrowers. Government is a net borrower. Only the households are the net savers. Now, even within the household sector financial saving, it's only the household sector financial saving is available. If you save it in gold or real estate, that's not available for anybody to borrow. So household sector financial saving at that particular time was 10% of GDP. And this 10%, and then of course the foreign money remittances, or what you call the current account deficit basically, is about 1.5%. So they said that if 1.5% is required for the public enterprises, you have the net 10%, and out of this, if you want to keep 4% for the private sector to borrow, you are left with 6%, and that is equally divided between the center and the states. So the 3% number came in that particular sense. Now today, if you see, the net household sector saving, financial saving, is 6.5%. It has come down. Now, in this environment, public sector borrowing requirements, if you see, the government itself borrows 3.8, off-budget liability is another 0.8, and on top of it, public sector enterprises borrow about 2%, and then you have the state governments borrowing about 2.7%. So almost 9% of GDP goes away. Your net household sector financial savings is 6.5%. So now you have a problem. What do you do? So from time to time, what happens is that you have a liquidity problem because and when the government comes, there is no the money available. So when that happens, the Reserve Bank of India purchases the government securities through what is called the open market operations. And that is nothing but indirectly monetizing the deficit. You are basically, in fact, last year they had the open market borrowing of the tune of something like 3 lakh crore. And this year, it will be possibly much more.
And on margin, that's what sets in fiscal inflation. Right? So the moment... No, this is not creative. This is before the age of creative accounting.
Because you're fixing the...
Creative account shows itself in terms of the fiscal deficit numbers.
Because the government has to
make
meet...
into account all that.
This
But
is
the
actually
point is, there is not sufficient household sector financial saving for massively borrowing this thing. And in 1996, there was an agreement between the Reserve Bank and the Ministry of Finance that they will not monetize the deficits in future. Earlier, there was an automatic monetization of the deficit. The Reserve Bank, Government of India could ask the Reserve Bank of India, I'm selling you these securities, you subscribe to them. But that has stopped then because, that led to a lot of inflation. So that was that's a blunt instrument of putting a control, but that's what was done. But now the people now arguing, saying that, why are you having this control at all? Because the economy, the private sector is not borrowing. But then you can't get the interest rates down if the government borrows more. That's one thing. The second thing is the interest payment by the central government constitutes somewhere about 28-29% of its revenue. Because the debt has accumulated so much that the interest paid by the government is... So, when you pay so much of interest, that is the problem. Then, the point that I talked about, not having enough money for the private sector, this is what is called the financially crowding out the private sector. And obviously, private sector will have to borrow at very high interest rates because the amount of money available is low. The third thing is that, if the money that you borrow is not properly utilized, your children have to repay that. There is something called intergenerational equity. If the money is utilized well, there is no problem. It will generate enough resources to pay back. But otherwise, the future will have to pay. So, there is a passing on the burden to the future generation. And fourth, the credit rating agencies, the international credit rating agencies, look at what your deficit numbers are and then rate your country. And depending upon that, even the foreign borrowing, the rate of interest gets determined. So there are a variety of reasons for being a good fiscal fundamentalist.
Let me ask, how many people here have in your household own a mutual fund? Yeah, it's not 100%, it's like 80%. By the way, I don't know why it shouldn't be 100% in a well-educated, English-speaking, fully aware room, right? Mutual funds Indian mutual fund system is among the most amazing savings vehicles in the world. And till 2 years ago, was it not even taxed? So there's really no excuse for the 20% of you who don't have it. But I asked the same question in the Taj in Bombay, and it was 20% who said yes. Can you believe it? So we have a dramatic under-financialization of savings from households, even today. And you can see it in this room, at least partially, but if you go outside and just nail it on the average guy, it's nothing. And it's a robust, scalable, large-scale system, and we don't use it. And this is just for after-tax money, pre-tax money through pensions, so nobody should even talk about. So this lack of savings is what creates that number. And on a comparative basis with the rest of the world, by the way, the EU number is also 3%. And there is a sort of magic to this, and the magic comes from the fact that in most economies, because of the savings rates, you end up with this sort of, when the fiscal side of the house becomes inflationary, approximately at 3%. So it might be a rule of thumb, but that's the number.
No, the interesting part was there was
Sorry,
a fiscal,
3% federal.
I'll just finish.
So
Fiscal,
think of it as 10% total.
no, fiscal review committee, which was chaired by N.K. Singh, one day when I was having a discussion, he said, Govind, this is completely madness, 3%. You know, this we have simply copied it from the Maastricht Treaty. That's a condition for the joining the EU. Now, I said, Singh Saab, that's not right. You know, you please read the report of the 12th Finance Commission, you will see that. And then I actually sent the relevant pages, photocopied and sent it to him. And then in his report, in fact, he went further. He reiterated what Rangarajan committee had said and said that no, now the union government fiscal deficit should come down to 2.5% in the next few years. It's a net saving. Yeah, yeah. No, in fact, household
Borrowings.
No, it is net household saving is, you see, gross is somewhere about 9%. Net household saving is 6.5. You know, you have both figures available.
And may have changed in the very recent
I'm
past.
thinking in the last 3
Because
years.
if every bank has only one growth area,
No,
and
no,
that is
this-
uncollateralized lending to consumers. So
This is
might have changed.
this is the estimate for 2018-19.
My other question to you is, you talked about presumptive taxation. Almost like this 1%. On this entire digital India has been one positive sign. The Digital India program has been one positive sign. It has facilitated e-commerce, and they've gone ahead with a 1% tax. What's your sense?
Yeah, again, you know, apne hi paon pe khuladi marna kind of thing. I don't know. You know, the old Robert McNamara quote comes to mind, which is in India, the enterprising have no scruples and the scrupulous have no enterprise. So the government behaves that way as well. So I think they're trying to nail the fact that all these guys are not in the GST net. They are very clever because the GST system we have designed, we didn't do the technology right. So nobody can catch them. So therefore, they are riding their luck till when somebody can catch them. So the government saying, now let me at least catch them by putting 1% TDS so that I know they exist. And if I know they exist on the revenue side, then I can figure out what their rough contribution to GST indirect tax should be. So it's again that same penny tax idea that says, get into the net because you're not paying the tax.
Now, and let me,
I know.
let me add, let me add to this. You know, willful avoidance of the tax or tax abuse, both by multinational and more so by digital companies, has been widespread world over. It's a world phenomenon. Now, that's one of the reasons why almost, over 100 countries have gone to the OECD. And OECD is having a special program on whole digital taxation, particularly for digital companies. And basically they have come up with a particular formula, but, there has to be an agreement, sort of basically trying to say that these digital companies have their head offices mostly in, advanced countries in the world. So there is a difference between the views of the advanced countries and countries. So they say that...
Dr. Rao, this is not that. That is a separate issue, which is jurisdictional issue where...
No, but therefore these people are doing some tax... These people are basically doing some, since that is not available, they're doing some, tax deduction at source.
No. But Sudhir, I think, and again, there may be CAs in the room, I don't know why they should charge 1%. They can charge 0.1%. Or 0.001%. Honestly, and this is all done by computers anyway, so why should we charge 1%? Particularly because 1%, as you say, on a 3% profit margin, gets locked up for 3 years and becomes yet another government lack of delivery on the other side, right? So when I file my actual tax return, if I claim back this 1%, it'll take them 3 years to pay it. So in effect, my 1% is hostage for 3 years. So I have to do the working capital cost of that 1% for 3 years. So you're right, but I don't know why we need, what is this magic of 1%? I understand the logic of the penny tax, but we can charge it at a penny. Why do we need to charge it at 1%? It's not that we are short of imagining the arithmetic at a lower decimal point. So I think that honestly, that's what the pushback should be. That do it at 0.001%, and it is a mandatory requirement. So you catch the people. You still catch the turnover. You just have to multiply by a different number. Instead of multiplying by 10, you did multiply by 1,000. Yeah, that's the other thing that Dr. Rao always says in GST. There's no reason to nail everybody. You nail the top 80%, that's enough. Why do you need to catch the last 20? Right now, it's all designed to catch the last 20%.
That is an international practice. By and large, internationally, on an average, the threshold is kept at $100,000. Okay? But if you keep the threshold at 50 lakhs here, instead of 20 and 40 as you have it present, 20 for services, 40 for 40, after a lot of effort, they changed. I looked at the Karnataka numbers I was telling him. 93% of the taxpayers are below 50 lakhs turnover. Their contribution, their turnover is 6.5%. Their contribution to tax is 11%. Why do you want to catch the minnows when you have the whales? In fact, it beats me. And then if you did that, your numbers will be manageable, your technology platform can be stabilized faster, and that's one thing. And the second thing is, this whole issue of matching every invoice, 10 rupee invoice, 50 rupees invoice, no country in the world does it. Korea tried it but failed. And so they moved over to some sort of, over a period of time, electronic invoicing. And not the 100%. They kept a threshold on the value of the invoices to be done. You can always have big data and go and make analysis of the big data. But we know, we want to have the most complicated tax system in the world, and we want to have everything to be done, and your technology platform just doesn't get cycled. I'm sorry, I will just tell a story, which we basically say it in, sort of a repeated games theory. It's the usual story that, the hot afternoon fellow, cap seller, goes around the market, sleeps under a tree, the monkeys pick up the caps, and this fellow wakes up and then suddenly remembers that they imitate, so he puts the cap down, they put the cap down, collects and goes. The story starts there. And his son also did the same thing, his grandson also did the same thing. And his grandson, the same thing happens, and he comes under that, lies down under that tree on the hot afternoon, and the caps are taken away by the monkeys. He gets up and sees, and then, he suddenly remembers what his grandfather told. He takes his cap and puts it down. The monkeys don't put the cap down. The big monkey comes, slaps him on the face, and tells him, "Do you mean to say only your grandfather will tell you what happened that day?" Now, basically, this is what we do. This is, people react to things that way. So if the probability, the tax compliance is a function of the rate of tax, probability of detection, and penalty rate. If the probability of detection is 0, people will not pay the tax. Today, your technology platform doesn't function, and that is because of the type of structure that you have, and including the threshold and the 4 rates, and in addition to cesses, and very high rates of tax in regard to construction, the entire construction material, and your affordable housing is 1% turnover, but the construction material is taxed at 28%. Cement, steel, everything. Now, so you get a huge gray market there. There is a big industry called fake invoice industry. Then you unleash the inspectors. So you create an inspector Raj. You wanted to avoid this, but then you create that both for automobiles and for construction. This is one of the things that we do for employment. Somebody talked about it. These are the labor-intensive sectors. And then the finance minister comes up and says that, Hawaii Chappal and Mercedes car are not the same. Of course they are not the same. Hawaii Chappal doesn't have a forward linkage in terms of employment. The Mercedes car does have. No, in other words, we don't look at the entire scheme of, what the general equilibrium effects are. We just go about designing things, and this is what happens. Sorry.
Last 2 or 3 questions, if we may, yeah. Last 2 questions, okay.
We have to get the economy going at a GDP rate of 10% for the next 15 years to get so many people out of the poverty line. This factor is known. How do we do that? Obviously would mean that we must identify projects, which it could be infrastructure projects, it could be construction, it could be new IT ideas or whatever, where jobs could be created so that people keep spending money, and through spending, there is a growth which happens in that. But for that, you require money. So now, how do you get the money? Is it okay if the government of India, sir, borrows money in the foreign market and forgets all about this fiscal deficit and revenue deficits and FPIs versus FDIs and all this theory which goes on, and says, hey, we need to get the economy going, and we need to get the jobs going, and we need to have projects which need to be funded, and we need to create an infrastructure for that like China did, and therefore let's spend. But it will be a long-term or a medium-term thing. There cannot be a quick fix. All that we are thinking about is a quick fix. Let's get the job tomorrow, let the economy go day after, and let's get out of this trouble there. It won't happen. I mean, that's a completely a pipe dream which is there. So we are all discussing on that subject, whereas what we have to do is a concerted, they've got 4 years to go. They've got the mandate. So the government says 4 years, this is the exact situation. We'll go through all the troubles, we'll go through the pangs, we'll borrow. Please don't question us on the fiscal deficit. Let's be honest, let's get things going. I think it's got to be a honesty, candor, good economics.
We'll add the last question there to this one. Hopefully it's the same, similar.
No, it's not.
Oh.
I was just wondering if you all had a comment on the monetizing of the highways as an asset. It seems to be inspired by Thatcherite economics, which, she famously sold off the railway tracks with disastrous consequences. So that proposal to monetize the highways as an asset.
Okay, we'll answer that. So on this one, there was a commentary, so we won't react too much, except the financing part. No, it's not necessarily, everything is not a quick fix, but the financing cannot simply be by borrowing. Now, whether you borrow from Indians or you borrow abroad, borrowing abroad has a double whammy. One, you're borrowing, and two, you're borrowing and converting into rupees. That produces not only a borrowing effect, but potentially inflation related to a depreciation of the rupee effect over time. So you can't simply print your way out of the problem. You can't borrow your way out of the problem. You actually have to grow your way out of the problem. And so... No, but it's a circular problem. It's a circular problem, right? So the money did actually come from the current account through the IT boom of the last 25 years, through the diaspora remittances, through some sort of consumption mechanisms in India where the trickle-down effects in various consumer industries worked, and so on. So this is what we have to do more of. There's no single magic bullet for such a heterogeneous country. There's just not.
I just want to say that we can't be Robert Mugabe's. Let me tell you that's precisely what he tried to do. He said that, I don't want to bother about the deficit, I will go on increasing money supply, and then you see what Zimbabwe ended up with. In fact, on 6th, Kilker is presenting his, releasing his book. I mean, it's not an estimate, but they say that, the government spending, in fact, 3 times more expensive in terms of its generation as compared to what the private. We do need infrastructure, everybody knows. And that is precisely the reason why we need investments. Much of the investment has to come from the private sector. And the government cannot really go on doing it. Government has to know what it should do. Government has to limit its, you don't have the governments that are benevolent anymore. In fact, you need to really have a system where they should interfere less and allow the markets to function in the way the markets generate the animal spirits. Now, for that, over a period of time, for example, investment will have to be eventually developed, funded through corporate bond markets. Now, governments don't have to, so you have I mean, this solution that you see, I will spend my way out is not going to work.
On your observation, it's a complex question because there's a political question into an economic question. And Margaret Thatcher, by the way, the context of Margaret Thatcher was very different, and Arthur's Cargill and so on. We can go into it offline. But there have been many instances of successful private, at least freight rail, for instance in Japan, for instance in the US, where it has actually worked quite well. So I think with proper safeguards and proper supervision mechanisms, it can definitely be an adjunct to the current railway system. The railway system, talking of 100 trillion rupees, which is not, there's no money to finance the 100 trillion rupees, but one big chunk of that 100 trillion rupees is the railways. And broad gauging and electrification of Indian railways has been held up now so we've been tinkering on the margin for the last 10 years now, and nothing really has happened after Konkan Railway in terms of real big investment in India. So I don't know how many of you have been traveled by long distance rail recently. It is terrible. I mean, it's frozen. It used to be quite good, but in the last 20 years, it's just declined dramatically. Yeah, highways too have been, I don't know about, tollways are already BOT or part privatized, to be discussed.
This budget also talks about...
Sorry? No, that's actually helped by this dividend.
No, this budget talks about monetizing the highways.
I know, but he's talking about it anyway. We'll talk about it offline. It's a little bit more complex question. So we will leave it at that. And thank you very much for your keen and sustained interest.